is that you have elites from one environment talking to elites from another environment. And this becomes a kind of a grand elite pact. Whereas actually, fundamentally, the story of growth and development, and this goes back to the role of the private sector, is a Zen story. It's, if you want to be free and developed, all you have to do is learn to let go.
Has international development aid done more harm than good in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, joining me to discuss is Dr. Greg Mills. He is the director of the Brenthurst Foundation in Johannesburg and the author of a book, Expensive Poverty, which details some of the problems with the international development model. Greg Mills, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
So Greg, your book, Expensive Poverty, highlights that sub-Saharan Africa has received over $1.2 trillion worth of development aid funding since 1990. That's quite a considerable sum. Why do we have so little to show for it? And what motivated you to write this book?
Well, I guess it's because I've spent the last 30 years working in this space. I've enjoyed multiple deployments with governments and government actors in different settings, from literally Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. And this has given me some biographical insights, if you will, and insights from interveners in different capacities. So with some in trying to make peace, and with others in trying to assist in diversifying economies, working in that full spectrum of external intervention. So it's not just about aid as we understand it as a development tool, but also aid as a stabilization tool, as a tool of trying to bring about some degree of stability in various settings, and not just in an African setting. So the countries that I look at here are involve Colombia, where I spent a great deal of time and wrote a book a few years ago on Colombia, in their remarkable transition from really a failed state into one that has a sort of normal political framework today, and other countries like El Salvador, in Latin America, but all the way across to others in East Asia, where I've also been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time. And then there's almost an entire chapter devoted to failure in Afghanistan, which is perhaps the most egregious contemporary example of external intervention that there is. So this was a way of putting down some of these biographical insights, and trying to understand why this is such a clumsy at best and such an ineffective tool when we measure it by its development outcomes. Maybe if we measure it by other criteria, it's a useful tool. Maybe these are strategic criteria about maintaining countries' interests, for instance. But when we measure it in terms of its developmental impact, for all of the money that you've already mentioned that has been given to Africa, $1.2 trillion, just in the last 30 years, so in a post-Cold War context, why this has been so ineffective. If you look at Africa's declining share of global GDP per capita, which is the most useful measure. So in 1960, for instance, Africa had a share of about 30% of the average wealth of an African compared to the average wealth of a global citizen, including all Africans. That has declined to about 15% in the last 60 years. And that decline has continued slower, but has continued in the post-Cold War period, half of that 60-year period. And if you add this into the enormous demographic change that Africa is currently experiencing, which is going to lead to Africa's population doubling between today and the year 2050, and most of that impact being felt in African cities, it clearly calls for an end to business as usual. So this book has been written with both this experience in mind, and the lessons that I have learned along the way and that others have taught me, and working with governments has taught me, plus the fact that really the circumstances have changed. We really have to develop a new way of doing things, otherwise we face a rather disastrous, potentially calamitous future ahead of us. in Africa. So what lessons can we learn from our own experiences and from others has been the central focus of this book, and indeed the central focus of the Brenthurst Foundation over the last 17 years of its existence.
So Greg, developmental aid is as much about the recipients of aid as it is about the donors themselves. So a developed country like the United Kingdom would have the Department for International Development, so would allocate a proportion of GDP to developmental assistance. That donor funding would be linked to projects, would be a direct fiscal transfer. It seems on its face that should be a fairly simple affair, that you give more money to a recipient country and that helps with improving infrastructure or helps with social programs, healthcare, etc. So what goes awry from that process of the developmental aid being granted and the money just seeming to not really have much of an impact or not the desired effect?
Well, the simple answer is a lot. A lot goes awry because starting from the very beginning, countries have liked to set this 0.7% of GNP figure to sort of design their development spending around it. And the metrics of aid expenditure have often been about adhering to that figure rather than being about how useful the expenditure is per se. And in part, this is because, governments, it's more about the donor than it is about the recipient's needs. So, from the outset, the fact that you're adhering to this figure is indicative of where the onus lies in the aid debate. It's really about how much you're giving, not about how it is being spent. And that, of course, relates to a much more profound problem within the countries receiving aid, because they receive aid often, not always, but often because they're actually in sort of basket case circumstances and they're unable to develop. And that's precisely why they want aid. And that's precisely why they don't spend it very effectively. It's also the wrong metric to have, this tool of measuring expenditure, because it presumes that the money is being spent for good purposes. It also presumes that it's been spent for developmental purposes. And often so-called strategic aid is actually more about the giver's needs and interests than it is about the recipient's needs and interests. And the example that I use in the book is really about Uganda, and that this is money that has been given to Uganda because of its strategic role in the region, rather than because of its domestic political circumstances. And that, if you had to measure Uganda in terms of its political economy, which is the important measure in terms of the way in which it's developing and how to reinforce a sort of good progress of development, you wouldn't be giving it any money at all, because essentially you're supporting an increasingly authoritarian leader in managing a country designed for the interests of a small elite. But you're giving it because Uganda has strategic benefit in terms of its role in Somalia, in terms of its role in South Sudan. So this is often about the donor rather than about fundamentally the recipient. But it's also because in many instances, the people who are spending this money actually don't have a clue about how countries develop. They think that this is all about government to government relations. It's all about supporting governance and state structures, where in fact countries get rich by making things and selling them. They get rich by trading, that's a traditional route to prosperity, by investing in business, and business generally profits from the circumstances that government creates, but that businesses are really required to make countries wealthy, to pay taxes, to develop an economy to speak of outside of government. And by reinforcing the link of accountability with government and not supporting businesses primarily, essentially you're trying to get countries to develop in an opposite way to that which donors themselves have developed in. And that always seems to be the most curious part of aid giving to me, is that donors expect countries that they're giving aid to develop in a wholly different framework and fashion to they themselves have developed. And then the kind of people that you're employing in these roles are people whose interests often are antithetical to those of business. They, in many instances, don't like business. They're people who come from a strong development background, and those backgrounds generally see business as a kind of necessary evil rather than as something to be encouraged and to be supported. And they don't understand the kind of market forces that operate behind businesses, and often they're antithetical to those sort of market realities. So fundamentally, you try to turn aid giving into a technical business. That, you know, if we can change this measure, that the following, you know, will emanate. Whereas in fact, you know, then that then leads to a focus on infrastructure, it leads to a focus on logistics, all of which is good stuff. But you need to understand the politics behind the political economy, why decisions are made, why some things happen. And I say one of the big learnings in my life is simply understanding that things happen for a reason, but things also don't happen for good reason. So the presumption amongst people who give aid is often that if we just, you know, enlighten the recipient, they will get stuff done because they didn't know beforehand what the impact of their actions would be. Well, that's entirely foolhardy and just wrong. Of course, they understand what the impact of their actions would be, but things work in certain ways precisely because there is a rationale. It may not be the rationale that donors appreciate, but there's a domestic rationale for things working in a particular way. And I often use the example of border posts in this regard. You know, things slow down at border posts for good reason, because there's a local economy built around that border post. And they're not thus operating in the fashion that Europeans, for instance, have come to understand about border posts, which is a sign that you approach at 80 kilometers an hour and flash through at 80 kilometers an hour. You stop in Africa for long periods of time, often, particularly if you're on a truck, precisely because there is an economy around that. So the problem is primarily political, and thus the actions of donors should address that. But overall, donors have pretended to sort of say, well, you know, it's really a technical preoccupation. We'll go around fixing all these things, and they end up getting the same results over and over again. And spending on political activities among donors is highly controversial because Africans resist it because it's seen as conditionality, and that's a swear word today, and smacks of so-called structural adjustment. And the Washington consensus is the other terminology thrown around. But actually, development is profoundly political. It's about the political choice you make in the allocation of resources and the difficulty that you have and the challenges that you then manage in carrying out policy reforms. And so aid expenditure should, I would argue, disproportionately favor certain political conditions rather than just simply giving money on the grounds either of strategic interests, the Uganda example, to use that again, or to believe that these things are just technical. And if you solve a few technical issues, that somehow you're going to resolve the problems that lie behind the malfunctioning of certain areas of governance. And what the book points out is, in fact, as I say, things work for a reason, but they also don't work for reasons, and we need to understand that. And I guess one of the advantages of my job is I've had a lot of time out in the field, as you pointed out at the outset. And I've been able to use my eyes, ears, and mouth and the ratio that God gave them to me in simply observing why things work in some ways, and conducting a lot of route diagnostics has been one feature of that, actually doing time and motion studies across various regions of Africa and further afield, sitting on trucks, understanding the way things work on the ground. So it's a rather bottom-up view of the political challenges rather than a top-down view of development, which I've tried to convey in this book. So, you know, I do believe that Africa has huge opportunity, and I do believe that fundamentally we've been held back by the nature of decisions which are made or not made to be able to encourage those opportunities to manifest. There was a a great expression by Bobby Wine, the Ugandan reggae artist turned politician, and I've done a song with Bobby on this book. And the reason why I sort of drew together with him was I heard what he had said to the Americans when he was asked about what the United States should be doing in Uganda to try and create a different political atmosphere. And he was, of course, being confronted and challenged by the repressive nature of the regime, and his supporters were being attacked and so on. And he said, well, just don't fund our oppressor. And the song we've written is Don't Pay Our Oppressor. And I think that's also a key measure of aid expenditure, which is to simply do no harm. So it's not just about trying to find ways to do good. It's also about finding ways to do no harm, to stop upending local systems and pathways to development progress because of your own instincts or ideas coming from outside as to how these things should operate, and stop reinforcing bad practices in your strategic interests. And I guess the one country I look at in this book, which is one that I spent a lot of time on a decade ago, is Rwanda. So, the presumption is that Rwanda is an exceptional example of development, but we don't really understand the political consequences of supporting what is effectively a minority regime in Rwanda, which displays acute authoritarian tendencies. Anybody that's elected with 99% of the vote, tends to set off warning flags and flares, and should do. But we see it as an exceptional example of the benefits of aid expenditure, the benefits of stability, but the counterfactual should be asked as to, would it be growing at a higher or lower rate without this authoritarianism? And are we simply reinforcing a practice of autocracy rather than, trying to encourage a more democratic system, which is undoubtedly more stable? And that's another one of the features of the book that we look at, that I look at, which is the relationship between democracy and development. And there's this growing empirical body of evidence to suggest that countries that are democratic are less volatile, grow faster, and because of the absence of volatility, tend to have a much greater compounding effect of growth. And so it's hard to encourage those conditions and stop trying to celebrate the exceptionalism of one or two rather dodgy analytical examples, Rwanda, Ethiopia, of course, which has been shown to have no clothes, to misquote the old expression, because of its absence of democracy, largely, and trying to understand thus aid as a political phenomena and the way in which it can influence political events is absolutely key to understanding the process of development.
All right. So, Greg, the Ethiopian example, I think, is a very good one. Meles Zenawi, who was a very powerful strongman there for many years, he was held up as a kind of a model of this kind of bureaucratic authoritarianism, imposing structural reforms from the top down. But as you've mentioned, the sustainability of these kinds of systems is often very poor. And when that strongman is removed, then often there can be a whole lot of other destructive forces that are unleashed. Many years later today, we're seeing this huge amounts of civil strife and instability and conflict in Ethiopia. And I wonder if Rwanda has maybe fallen into that same trap. Perhaps there's no outright violence there on the scale that we saw in the 1990s. But if the current regime were to weaken or collapse in some way, could we perhaps see a reversion back to some of that catastrophic conflict that we saw a couple of decades ago? So I guess that follows to my next question, is the role of security issues. We've spoken about economic liberalization. I think we should definitely look at the role of the private sector in driving growth and prosperity. That's very important. But none of that really matters if your country is engulfed by a civil war, or has been invaded by a foreign country, as we've seen with Ukraine now. So Do you think that there's a kind of a sequencing issue there, focusing on security and stability first, and then the economic liberalization? Or do you think that those two things go hand in hand?
Well, I do believe that security has a benefit all of its own, and I think you do need to have security. It's of course a chicken and egg question. Do you get security from inclusive development, or do you get security from keeping a lid tightly fastened down and gradually releasing it over time? The African example, if you look at military coups and the effects of military coups, is of a very detrimental effect of trying to do the security first approach. There are exceptional cases. Rwanda is one of them. But generally speaking, military regimes which have followed this idea of doing security first, military regimes have been particularly poor at development, in spite of the fact that they seemingly have all these levers of control at their disposal. And they tend to belie the whole authoritarian dictator or benevolent dictator, terminology or concept, where you have a strong man that has a sort of light touch, a relatively light touch, and that they are able thus to, in a kind of East Asian tradition, be able to push forward development decisions in a way that doesn't take into account all the parliamentarian and other niceties of governance. But the African record on this is very poor, is that authoritarians do even worse than democrats. Democracy might be very messy, but it's undoubtedly a more stable system. And we've seen in Africa the advantages of democracy, as I mentioned, through the empirical correlation between democracy and development. If you look at the categories that Freedom House outlines between unfree, partly free, and free, the freer the country, the better the performance outcome in Africa. And if you strip out those countries which are single commodity producers, the gap between the free and the other categories gets even wider. And that's because the freer the country, the more likely you are to invest in diversified industries. You don't have to be there, things, for instance, in things you dig out of the ground or pump out of the ground, you don't have to be there just for those reasons. You can be there for other good reasons, where you could be investing in a country X in Africa or country Y in East Asia in the same set of industries, because your investment is secure. So there is a connection between democracy and good governance. And that seems to indicate that the sort of military approach to providing security alone is insufficient. And certainly in the case of a country like Ethiopia, eventually, if you don't have this inclusive political approach, you end up basically replicating a sort of version of minority rule, which we know we're only too aware of in South Africa, of how unsustainable that is and how immoral that is. And you end up, replicating that, albeit in a different ethnic context in other places. So, the problem in Ethiopia really stemmed from the Tigrayans, which are about 6-7% of the population, through Meles Zenawi and through their victory in the war against the Derg of Mengistu, having a disproportionate impact on, control over, and benefit from the Ethiopian state and all the proceeds that went with it. And that was extremely resented by other majority groupings, the Amara and the Roma among them. And it set the stage for an increasing dysfunctionality, particularly after Meles died. And that sort of iron grip was attempted to be relaxed by his successor, Haile Mariam Desalegn. And then you have what you have today, where you have a somewhat haphazard rule of Abiy, who, albeit being filled with messianic certainty, hasn't proven to be as politically adept as managing all these different internal strains, and in fact has been quite crude in his approach, particularly towards the Tigrayans, which has resulted in this war. So, we tend to make the assumption that countries are an example of how, this benevolent dictator, which for me is an oxymoron anyway, but the sort of idea of a benevolent dictator works, and we would take a fixed moment in history. But when you look at a longer sweep of history, it looks like a far more shaky concept, particularly when you look at the relative performance of African democracies. But then that automatically brings us to the point, is how do you encourage greater democratic behavior? Now, what we had in Africa in the early 1980s was really just two countries, one of which was in the middle of the Indian Ocean, Mauritius and Botswana, which is a democracy, of course, but hasn't had a change of government at the polls. So, in true political science measurements, it's not really a democracy until you've had that happen. But in other measures, it sits as a democracy. You've gone from just two democracies, you went up to over 12, measured in the completely free category of Freedom House, as I described, by the turn of the century, the early 2000s. And now that's receded once more to around 8 countries. But the big change is in the number of unfree to partly free. So you've seen a significant migration into the partly free categories. And that illustrates that Africa is a far more democratic place today than it was during the 1980s and 1970s, when a combination of falling commodity prices, high oil prices, and increasingly undemocratic governance led to a rash of military coups, numbering over 100 in terms of coups and attempted coups today, which, as a consequence of which, you saw a significant deterioration in growth. And the big divide between Africa and East Asia really comes in the 1970s, when one doesn't just flatline, but actually regresses in Africa's case, compared to that in East Asia, which simply takes off. And the East Asians went from being as poor as Africa in the 60s to being, almost 10 times as rich across the board as Africa today. And this is an illustration of that stability that you're talking about. Now, in their instance, it's about also increasing democratization, but also a different style of governance which suits their circumstances. We know that in Africa today, from the work that Afrobarometer has done, that more than 2/3 of Africans who are routinely polled prefer democracy to any other system of governance. And the reason why they do is because of the relative benefits. They want to live in circumstances that safeguard their human rights, and they want to live in circumstances where, whatever the messiness of democracy, overall, it does better as an inclusive tool for upliftment. It's not just about elites, it's about a wider public who do better out of this system of government. So, I think the debate around stability first and democracy later may have been informed by East Asia, but in the Africa case, it's actually the other way around. It's about democracy first, if you want to have development and stability later. And as hard as that may be for some people who almost viscerally like to think that a benign dictator, to use that term again, is the way forward, actually in Africa, it proves to be a cul-de-sac, a dead end. And it prevents the sort of inclusive political structures and debates that are so necessary for stability. It was Kofi Annan who said that, democracy is a great conflict alleviation tool, because it really lets the pressure off. It's the way to stop these destabilizing elements upending a process. And that's certainly the experience in Ethiopia, that more democracy earlier probably would have prevented the sort of instability systemically that you have in Ethiopia. And even if the government is able to clamp down on this level of instability through its military, there's an enormous elephant in the room in terms of what the economic impact of this is. And in the case of Ethiopia, it has been tremendously deleterious and is going to probably bite them in years to come. So democracy and development are two sides in Africa of the same coin.
Yeah, there are many examples of how bad politics impacts on economies. So you can't really disambiguate economic development from political maturity and democratization. You just have to look at the example of Zimbabwe, how politicians immiserated what was at one point a very prosperous and productive economy through manipulating the monetary supply, for example, invading properties and undermining property rights. So, Greg, I mean, from the perspective of Western policymakers, I mean, I understand obviously there's been a lot of hubris in terms of their approach to development, but is there even a role to be played for developed economies in promoting growth in sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, should we just be taking an approach of, well, just liberalize the economies, let the invisible hand of the market take care of things, and make sure that the politics is right, that the state is a minimal state that doesn't interfere too actively? Is there any role at all for foreign actors, or do you think that they will inevitably make matters worse?
Well, I do think that the first premise is, as I mentioned, the importance of doing no harm. So, to take extreme examples, Afghanistan, where I spent a lot of time and did 4 assignments with NATO as a strategic advisor to the commander. And I was faced with, unbelievable aid projects, which had been the result of too much money being spent in an environment which simply couldn't absorb it. And so you ended up with these extraordinary follies: airports in Lashkargah, which had no flights, industrial parks, which had no electricity, seed projects, which are replicated many times over, all of which then compounded problems rather than resolved them. And there was huge opportunity cost in spending this money. I think, aid has to be fundamentally about a strategic undertaking. And strategy is, as the book tries to point out in its final conclusion, it's not just about resources. It's not just about money. Money is often equated with power and leverage, and certainly to an extent it has that. But in order to be able to turn money into something, you need a plan. You need an application of time, but you also need to understand what people you need to make this happen. That's another aspect of resources, and what institutions you have and what process and leadership that you require to be able to turn this into something worthwhile. In other words, hardware, cash, infrastructure is not enough. You need to have the software of people and governance. Now, I would argue that you also need to have a highly differentiated approach, so that aid to Africa is not just one thing. It's not one continent. It's, big countries, small countries. It's landlocked countries. It's double landlocked countries. It's some which have a strong tradition of parliamentary processes and oppositions that may have been suppressed, but they're there. They need to be consolidated and encouraged. You need to reverse situations of instability. You need to work through local actors in improving the interface between external agents and internal parties, particularly in these conflict situations. And that's certainly a study all of its own, albeit that the book looks at in a chapter at this, about where there's been failure in terms of external military provision. And fundamentally, you need to work with the grain of local solutions and local ownership, both of the problem and the solution. You can't work against that. You can't, as I once put it to a very frustrated American colonel in Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, I said, you can't plant a tree on Mars and expect for it to grow. It's not going to grow. So you need to understand why trees grow where they grow and try and encourage more successful examples that people can learn from and replicate, very much along the lines of the East Asian experience. And I think fundamentally, outsiders have to understand, to go back to this point of politics, that accountable government and leadership matters. And you need to find a way of incentivizing better, more representative and more responsible government. There's no hiding away from this factor. And, trying to encourage more authoritarian government through greater aid provision is just not just highly transactional. It's also not even the long run, in the short term, highly problematic from a moral perspective, but also highly problematic from a developmental perspective. I do think you need to think about a moral economy and not just one that lives in its own sort of bubble, free from the rest of the demands of those societies into which you're inserting development aid. So, and that of course plays into the elite nature of many development processes, that you have elites from one environment talking to elites from another environment, and this becomes a kind of a grand elite pact, whereas actually fundamentally the story of growth and development, and this goes back to the role of the private sector, is a Zen story. It's, if you want to be free and developed, all you have to do is learn to let go and not try and control everything and micromanage everything and leech off everything. So that then raises the question about what donors should do. And what I propose in the book is that donors should fundamentally not get into the business of conditionality per se and tell people what it is that they're doing as wrong, but simply get into the habit of supporting countries which are more likely to be successful than not, because of, and this would be my fundamental guideline, is, given what I said before, because of the democratic nature of their domestic representative government processes. So, in other words, provide greater assistance and access is another form of assistance, to those countries which are free, because they're the ones from the record that are more likely to develop. Of course, those at the other end of the scale, those that are authoritarian, are more likely to face some degree of upset in the future. That doesn't mean you should cut them off altogether. And this is often the extreme debate that one gets into, is people say, oh, well, are you suggesting we shouldn't provide humanitarian assistance and peacekeeping to those countries which, have scored an own goal through their lack of inclusive government? And I say, no, not at all. You can provide that. But at the same time, you shouldn't be giving military training or trade access or educational opportunities to those countries. And you should gradate your and carefully categorize the countries in this full spectrum of Africa in a differentiated way that really encourages a better system of domestic governance. And you're not excluding. You're simply saying, we're going to support success. We're going to reinforce success, because by reinforcing success, we're more likely to encourage others along this path. And that's the single biggest attribute of Western donors, is actually the fact that they have open and free systems that the majority of Africans want to live in, similar to that the majority of Africans want to live in. So use that as a tool to your advantage, because it's also in Africa's best interest to do that. So what I suggest doing is really inserting more politics into the debate about aid, not less politics, making it more technical. I think gets around, wrongly tries to get around the political aspect of the political economy, which lies at the heart of understanding why some countries are more successful than others. And I think from an analytical perspective, it was Kipling who said there were 6 honest men, what and why and when and how and where and who. And we always have to ask those questions. Any process of investigation and of analysis and recommendations has to understand why things happen, why they don't, why they're more likely to happen in particular circumstances. And then we need to try and encourage and foment those circumstances rather than ignoring the political questions that I think the difference between long-term development and long-term failure.
Yeah, and to your earlier point, Greg, about the failings of top-down approaches and the benefits of bottom-up, think one of the anecdotes that I always share as a good example of this are the play pumps, which were these children's carousels that were installed in replace of water pumps in rural Uganda. And when this innovation came out, it was all over the headlines in the newspapers that this is a fantastic way for young children to play on a carousel, get some exercise, and simultaneously pump water up from under the ground. And when these were installed, there wasn't really proper consideration given to the local culture, the local circumstances. These pumps would often break down. It would take 2 weeks for somebody to come and fix it. Usually in a rural village, there's somebody who can fix a normal manual water pump. Many of these children were malnourished, so when they pushed the carousel, they often got tired after 5 minutes, and then the elder woman in the village had to come and now push the carousel, which was a bit embarrassing for them. And basically this whole project kind of fell apart. And so sometimes these newfangled solutions from somewhere in Europe or America, they're often well-intentioned, they seem good on paper, but they just, in terms of implementation, kind of completely collapse. So I think that understanding local circumstances is really absolutely critical for development.
Yeah, and I think often we try and do sort of templatic aid, where we take something that's worked elsewhere and try and apply it. And I do think that some of the challenges that we face in this regard are particularly with infrastructure and the way in which infrastructure expenditure is managed, and the degree to which one can then seed local ownership into these programs. And I do think, and the book goes into this, how China, among other donors, but particularly the Chinese, given that they have huge economic heft, have kind of upset the good governance apple cart. I don't blame China, as some like to do. I blame African leadership because the Chinese have simply sought opportunity like any business would, but they've also profited from the absence of governance because they've been able to loan money at terms which suit the Chinese, at least in the long run, into schemes whereby the local elites have profited given the absence of governance. And we need to think about ways in which we can prevent this from happening from an African standpoint. And the way in which I advocate some of these improvements happening is if those who fund them and who build them operate them, because then they have to have a revenue model and a financial model which matches the cost. And often the costs are massively inflated because of all the money that's flowing under the table. And then who ends up paying for this? And I'll take the example of Zambia in this instance, is the public and the next incoming administration, who then has to clean up the balance sheet to be able to make things work again. So you take the case of Zambia, which in the early 2000s had, after HIPC, had a debt stock of about $500 million US. Today has 30 billion roughly dollars of debt, half of it internationally owned and half of it domestically owned. The domestic portion of which is because of high expenditure on civil servants, which the government liked to encourage because that was a good source of votes. We've seen this movie over and over again, not just in Africa, but elsewhere too. And then, of course, you've got roughly half spent on foreign debt, on euro bonds and other sources of traditional debt. And about half of the external amount is from Chinese loans into the system. Now, the Chinese don't do grants, they do loans. And so all of this money comes with a tag, which somebody has to pay at some point in the future. And they're very reluctant to do debt relief, the Chinese. They don't do that historically. They even still still hold the debt from the Tazara Railway in the early 1970s, for instance. And that just debt rolls over and over and over and provides a means of leverage. So these are part of the changing conditions and circumstances of aid. China has been a new source of money, but it's not been a free source of money at all. And Africa has to know what it's getting into in order to be able to manage this in an effective way, not simply pass this loan or this amount of debt, this future obligation down to future generations. They need to set up systems which can pay for themselves. That's the key bit about infrastructure. Not all infrastructure is going to pay for itself, but we do know how to get much of it to pay for itself today, particularly electricity, roads even, and certainly airports. And so you see these vanity projects springing up all over the place, which are clearly never going to pay for themselves. Stadia being the most numerous illustration of this. And we have to avoid this like the plague and focus on stuff which really has a development aspect to it. And Asia's been excellent at doing this. And we can certainly learn great lessons from Asia's own experience in managing outsiders and the way in which they give money. We have to learn to manage outsiders better. And as the book terms it, not be a cheap date.
Yeah, and free money comes with its own problems as well. It can create moral hazard in that, well, we can be prolific in our spending, but the donors will bail us out, or we can take a haircut on the debt and all will be fine. And then the cycle repeats. And that can create a sort of moral hazard. And I think one of the other problems with, seeking out these big international loans is, often that's on a floating interest rate. It's dollar denominated. So if your currency depreciates, then suddenly your debt payments really spike. So I think developing local capital markets, developing that accountability relationship with local taxpayers as well is really important, and developing that domestic tax base. So Greg, just in terms of closing off this conversation, I'd like to know just more about your work with the Brenthurst Foundation and what you're hoping to achieve in your work going forward. I know you have a new book coming out on South Africa as well, and we haven't spoken much about SA in this conversation. What is that about, and what is next for you in terms of your work with the Brenthurst Foundation?
Yeah, well, it's a pretty ambitious agenda always. The foundation has a sort of strap line of strengthening Africa's economic performance. So we continue to work, and I spend about half my time working with African governments at the invitation of the head of government, and a lot of time currently being spent in Zambia in resolving problems, but also setting up a new developmental framework. And we tend to operate in a whole bunch of countries simultaneously, doing similar types of work, which is discreet and not public in terms of its content. And the client, as it were, well, I say client because they don't pay for it, but the client, as it were, is the government that invites us in. And we work with my board in particular, led by President Olusegun Obasanjo, in these environments. And it's extremely rewarding to see these changes being made and to see some successes which will have strategic benefit, multipliers across the economy and across the society in terms of their outcomes. And we're not always successful, of course not. And I deal with this in the book and the role of outsiders. One of the great lessons I've learned is if anybody asks you to write a paper about something, you've already failed. So we tend to use whatever papers we're writing or books we're writing as hooks for a debate, to put down some lessons learned for ourselves as much as anybody else. So that's about half the time. And the other half of the time is working on big sort of, public thinking works, public intellectual works, I guess they could be grandly entitled. And currently I'm focused, based on my experience in Afghanistan, and I wrote a book at the end of last year on that experience called The Ledger. I'm focused a lot on understanding the implications of Afghanistan for African security, particularly for those countries which fall into the sort of fragile category, and that's really right across the Sahel. And if you throw into the mix of, sort of fragile state structures, divided states, territories, changing external circumstances, and then, in top of all of this climate change, a lot of them look particularly wobbly. And you've seen a rash of military coups in West Africa and the Sahel, from Guinea-Conakry all the way to Mali and Burkina. And this looks like a trend which one has to understand to improve the external methodology of engaging, whether this be external Western or external somebody else, it doesn't matter. We need to understand what the root causes of these conflicts are and how best, if there is a best practice, in intervening in them. So a lot of my time has been taken up with that, and we're running a series of workshops and work with policymakers, always with policymakers, in getting to grips with understanding how to improve that external-internal interface in this regard. And then, we have this book on South Africa. As I said, we're very much focused on best practice globally, and we've tried to apply some of that to understanding what a set of better choices is with regard to the South African economy. And myself and Ray Hartley have worked with Haroon Borat of UCT, and Mcebisi Jonas is also on my board, the former Deputy Finance Minister. And we've produced this compendium with a bunch of authors who are experts in their respective fields, everything from municipal government to power to policing and security. All of it forms part of this work. And I hope that it's a marker, at least in the process, to remind us that both there are challenges and we need to identify what they are, but also that solutions are within our grasp. And one of the things we did with the authors is not to end up with a long treatise each on what the problems are, because we hear enough about that, but actually to focus on a few things that government can do immediately in a focused fashion. And each of them have risen to that challenge and been able to provide that. So it's quite a refreshing, I like to think, contribution, not the final word by any manner of means, but quite a refreshing contribution to the debate. And that's overall, finally, what the foundation is about. We're about trying to apply best practice, identify what it is, and then apply it to circumstances, working through a bunch of relationships that we've spent 30 years, in my instance, cultivating. And that, for me, is perhaps the most rewarding part of all of my work. I really do enjoy meeting people. I really enjoy hearing their stories, hearing their challenges, sitting with them, getting to know them, getting to know their fears and aspirations and difficulties and their personal stories of how they get to wherever they got to. And that's the critical kind of conduit, the ink spot through which all these ideas travel, and the most rewarding part of me for my job. It's although development sometimes has been sort of characterized as a sort of technocratic function, it's actually fundamentally a human story, both in terms of the way in which you go about development, but also fundamentally it's about the people whose lives you can affect.
Yeah, and I think this conversation has been a fantastic illustration of the importance of understanding human behavior, and that manifests itself in political institutions, in economic relations. And I think it's good to be humble when you approach these very complex systems. But I think your work is also a testament to the importance of doing that hard work, of trying to find those systems that can work better to unlock human flourishing. So, Greg Mills, I wanted to thank you very much for joining me on the show.
Thank you very much, and keep up the good work.